The founders of the Giant's Causeway electric tramway were William Trail and his brother Anthony, who was Provost of Trinity College, Dublin. The Trails were a well-known family from the town of Bushmills. The Giant's Causeway is a world-famous beauty spot with many strange and wondrous stone formations, each with a story of its own. This is the Giant's organ, once played by Finn McCool, and the amphitheatre, so called on account of its circular formation, the rope bridge at Carrigarita in the well-known Guinnessad, the ponderous Dunluce Castle, once home of the Macquillans, and Port Coon, famous for smuggling and treachery. The tram commenced running from January 1883. However, the official opening did not take place until the 28th of September, when Earl Spencer, the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, performed the ceremony in open car number 3. The tram set off from the railway station at Portrush, passing White Rocks and Dunluce Castle, before turning inland to the town of Bushmills, a distance of 6 miles. In 1887 the line was extended a further 2 miles to the world-famous tourist attraction, the Giant's Causeway. The original rolling stock were supplied by the Midland Carriage and Wagon Company of Manchester, and apart from 2 saloons, they were mostly open or toast rack type. The tipping wagons were built by Messrs Ross and Walpole of Dublin, designed by Mr Gagan, an engineer with Guinness's Brewery. The Portrush tram depot was built of black, hammer-dressed basalt, local to the region, with white stone featuring at corners and around openings. In the early days of the line, 2 Wilkinson steam trams provided the main service on account of the temperamental nature of the electrical equipment. As the power supply was provided at track level, the steam trams hauled the trains through the town of Portrush until an overhead power supply was introduced in 1899. In the 20s, the steam trams were sold to a building contractor, and one survived until the 30s. This is Portrush Station about 1910. Originally, the open motor trams had no canopies, but when a trolley head fell and struck a passenger, it was decided to add canopies to all the fleet. Dunluce Castle was one of the most prominent features along the route of the tramway, and was the ancestral home of the McQuillan family until conquered by the MacDonalds. Number 7 was one of the original open-powered trams, but was later converted into a saloon, and later again reconverted back to an open trailer. The Bushmill tram sheds were built about the time of the Causeway extension and extended again in 1909. The Bushmill station dates from the origin of the line in 1883. And here we see the station after the introduction of the overhead power supply. The rolling stock had highly ornate siding, more reminiscent of a stagecoach than a tramcar, and the steam trams were also gaily ornate to match the rolling stock, which were painted Tuscan red and cream, an arrangement which was known locally as blood and custard.
Nothing but moonlight. Will you be gone when the dawn comes stealing through? Are these just moon dreams?
An ornate shelter was provided at the Giant's Causeway terminus, which was imported directly from Switzerland at a cost of £400. In those days, this sum would have purchased a complete electric tram car.
Don't let me love you if I must pay for your kiss with lonely tears.
On numbers 9 and 10, the ornate siding on the waist panels was omitted until a later date.
It's true love. Say you'll be mine when the
It was suggested by H. Fail in his book on the narrow gauge railways of Ireland that number 9 was a reconstruction of one of the earlier stock, and if so, it could claim to be one of the oldest electric trams in existence. In the latter years, windscreens were fitted to some of the trams to give a greater degree of shelter to motorman and passengers alike. This is a rare glimpse of the line's tar wagon, which gave working access to the overhead system. The River Bush was crossed by the steel girder bridge, built for the Causeway extension in 1887, the year of Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee. In 1937, this tram was purchased from the Dunfermline Tramways in Scotland. Number 9 was the most active tram during the winter months, and this rather crude box-like vestibule was added in 1909. It was replaced with a finer vestibule in 1945, when the ornate sidings from car number 3 were also added to the waist panel. Werner von Siemens, born in 1816, first demonstrated the principle of the dynamo in 1866 and soon followed the electric motor. The first electric traction experiment was carried out at the Berlin Trade Exhibition in 1879 when a small electric locomotive hauled 3 open carriages along a 300-metre length of metre-gauge track. Small though this little experiment was, it demonstrated the feasibility of electric traction. The first public passenger carrying service was inaugurated in 1881 in Lichterfelde in Berlin, which ran a distance of 1.5 miles, using converted horse tramway stock. A year later, another small demonstration line was inaugurated in Charlottenburg, as shown on this contemporary sketch. The Giant's Causeway tramway is generally accepted as being the first substantial electric tramway in the world. The Volks Electric Railway on Brighton Pier, inaugurated in August 1883, claims to be the first regular electric tramway service in the British Isles. The Trail Brothers Tramway had a most distinguished career, and its impact upon the world was immense. The staff showed the greatest of loyalty throughout the system's checkered history. From its introduction, the line was regarded with awe. To see the trams drawn by the invisible force of electricity was difficult to understand at first, but later the wonder changed to deep affection. Local people were proud of their tram, and stories are prolific, enriching over the years like a good wine. It must have been with a heavy heart that the system was finally closed, and this was a tragic error, for if the trams were running today, it would be one of the world's finest attractions, steeped in history and folklore. The running stock was auctioned off in 1951, and many of the trams ended their days as chicken coops or sheds.
makes
Saloon car number 2 of the system was fortunate, however, and when the new Belfast Transport Museum was formed in the mid-50s, it was taken under cover and restored.
Wish upon a star as dreamers do. Fate is kind. She lives to the
Number 5 was also fortunate and managed to survive until taken by the Belfast Transport Museum.
secret love.
Number 5 was a 6-bench toast rack seating 24 persons when fully laden, and was identical to number 6 and 7.
Fate steps in and sees you through. When you wish upon a star, your dreams come true.
All these trams dated from the origin of the line. The transverse seats were open on the landward side, and full-length running boards or continuous steps were provided. The tram had an overall length of 18 foot 6 inches, and the roof was fitted at a later date. This tram car can be seen at the Witham Street Transport Museum in Belfast. Number 9 was purchased by Miss Nellie Marr, who was the librarian in the town of Youghal in Cork until her death in the late 70s. The tram was then transported by rail from the little seaside resort of the Causway in the uppermost part of Ireland to the town of Youghal in the furthest extremity of the south, a distance of 300 miles.
Makes a bee think of honey, just as I think of
She arrived in Youghal in 1951.
is crazy. Your whole perspective gets hazy.
The tram was lived in by Nellie, and she added a small shed to one side, and during the summer months she served hot water for tea to the holiday makers in the area.
A gentle touch, and then a kiss, and then
Nellie lived here for over 30 years.
imagination again. Oh well, imagination.
A neighbour, Mr. Ahern, sheeted the tram with aluminium to help prolong its life, and the tram remained absolutely complete until Nellie's death.
Temple I go around wanting you, and yet
For the last number of years, the tram has lain derelict and tragically was badly vandalised, and all the ornate windows broken. The Youghal Council, conscious of its value, contacted the Ulster Transport Museum authorities at Cooltra, and a representative came and inspected the car. However, they were unable to take it. Hearing of my work on the restoration of the Hill of Oath tram, the town clerk, Mr. Larry Cunningham, asked if I would accept responsibility for the tram and have it removed, as the site was required to be vacated. I carried out an inspection of the tram and realised that it was essential to get the tram under cover without any delay if it was to survive. I contacted Frank Curran of the PMPA and asked for his help.
So very early One Saturday morning in October we set off from Dublin, having left at 5:30 a.m. with a light tow truck on the back of a low loader. Now this is the object as we saw it on the seafront at Youghal in September 1982. The thing appeared to be just a big bundle of firewood, and in fact, when it was being removed, two teenagers said their Halloween bonfire was to have been based on the tram. Mind you, there are those amongst us who would have preferred if it was in the Halloween bonfire. However, Jim Kilrow, being the spoofer that he is, convinced us that this thing was indeed a valuable vehicle which had to be saved. Now, before we could move the tram, we had to remove the concrete base to which it was fixed. As well as the concrete base, there were a number of reinforced concrete pillars, which presented a rather bigger problem than we had anticipated. At that time there were plans to have it taken to Dublin, where somebody had promised to provide facilities for its restoration, but shortly afterwards this offer was found unsuitable. It was then that the joint managing director of PMPA, Seamus O'Mora, stepped in and instructed that this piece of Irish history must be saved as a matter of urgency. However, we weren't short of help, having brought Liam Moore and Mick Curran with us, together with Kevin Renan from the Inland Fisheries Board, Kevin being well known for his films on pollution. While we were doing the whole thing, there were a gang overhead having a bird's eye view of the whole situation. Having removed the concrete base, we had to make up a trolley in order to make the thing mobile and get it out onto the road. We had to remove a number of obstacles which were in the way, including this old wooden shed. We then jacked it up, placed the trolley underneath it, then lifted it and towed it out towards the road. On the way out to the road there was what appeared to have been a small bush, but the small bush had very long roots, and this held us up for some considerable time. In fact, the roots of the bush were so strong that they bent one of the axles on the trolley, and here you can see one of the wheels lying in.
The tram slowly descended Clay Castle Hill as far as Youghal station, but this time returning northwards. It was necessary to push the tram backwards onto the low loader, a task over which Frank and his helpers took great care. I was informed that this was a very delicate part of the operation, and without care stress could be placed on the undercarriage, and if badly rotten the tram could literally fall asunder. The original oak underbeams proved to be still very robust and showed no signs of strain. Some local people gathered around to bid the old tram a fond farewell. Can you imagine the looks of surprise the PMPA were given in running a tramcar to Dublin? They must have wondered, what will Joe Moore get up to next? The tram then completed the last lap of its journey to Dublin to enable the restoration work commence. The first task is to allow the causeway to thoroughly dry out for 12 months or 18 months before serious restoration work can begin. To assist in this, it was necessary to remove the rocker panels and the aluminium cladding to permit the dry air to freely circulate. Some crude bracing was temporarily fitted to avoid any distortion. While the tram is drying out, Leo Mason, the team's blacksmith, is making up some of the reinforcing angles to replace those badly corroded. Leo has also made up the structural steel for the Hillepost tram. Dudley Ryder of Bagot Lane helps in running off some temporary shoring timbers and replacement mouldings for the causeway. And so the restoration programme has now indeed commenced. The first task is to replace the 4 corner pillars and renew the steel reinforcing angles. Meantime, the only female member of the restoration team, Helena, is unconscious of me filming her as she scrapes down one of the sliding doors. After final adjustments, the first new teak corner pillar is fitted in position and secured with angles. With one of the bulkhead sections structurally completed and panelled, Bill has already made a start on the second. The main task in 1984 is to scrape away the decayed timbers along the undercarriage, and this tedious task was undertaken by Martin over a period of several months. Later that year, a second pillar was installed, and this gives great strength to the bulkhead. On the opposite side of the tram, a third pillar was built into part of the original pillar in early 1985, and it is difficult to detect the joint. A replacement beam along the undercarriage on one side has now been bolted into position, and gradually renewed strength is returning to the old tram's bones. The structural demarcation of the extensive rebuild and addition of roof in 1887 can be clearly seen. There can be little doubt that number 9 was one of the low-sided garages dating from the origin in 1883. Work continued on the causeway until the structural parts on the landward side were completed, apart from the window mullions, and the roof was carried on the 2 end bulkheads and the central bulkhead which separated first and second class. At this stage the PMPA closed down on Saturdays, and it became necessary to cease work on the Causway tram for a period of 18 months or so. It was painful to abandon work, but more time was spent on the other trams being restored by the team, so the sojourn was well spent. At last a space became available in the Howth Transport Museum, and in autumn in the year of the millennium, the day of her removal from the PMPA came, and the tram spent a few days at Broadstone bus station. The PMPA garage at the Long Mile Road had provided a safe refuge for the Hill of Howth tram, the Causeway, and the Merryweather fire engine for a number of years, and it was not without some sadness that it was necessary to vacate the premises, and we owe Frank Curran a debt of gratitude for the help he gave us as original manager of the recovery section, and a special thanks also to the many PMPA staff who showed us such friendship. Later that day, the tram arrived at Howth Castle. Compared with the removal of the director's car or the Lucan bogie standard, the transport of the causeway was a comparatively easy task, and apart from gentle handling on account of her delicacy, the team looked upon the task as chicken feed. It did not take very long to push her into position, set her up on tram jacks, and happy to say restoration work can now proceed once more. What did this little tramway achieve throughout its historic career? Von Siemens created the first electric locomotive and placed it on display at the Industrial Exhibition in Berlin in 1879. Later the locomotive appeared in London, Paris and Vienna, but apart from its obvious fascination for crowds, no corporate body showed any tangible interest in this new electric mode of transport. In desperation, von Siemens set up a small one-car system in Lichtenfelde to demonstrate the viability of electric traction and iron out some of the early problems, but it wasn't until the Trail brothers contacted him that any real interest was shown in this new transport invention. The world looked on as the Giant's Causeway tram proved to be both economical and viable, and it wasn't long before the great European cities followed the example of the Trail brothers. Work on the landward side was structurally completed and panelled out in Howth. The rocker panel, which swept back in traditional coach building style known as a tumble home, was made up from 4 1/8-inch ply laminates, scored and glued and pinned together in one continuous piece, forming an immensely strong base, screwed at close intervals into the new structure. Number 9, discarded and considered by many to be beyond salvation, is slowly returning from the grave of oblivion. And over the years ahead, who knows, will run again, an echo from the dawn of electric traction.
The Causway Tram. I'll tell yous of a vehicle I hope yous all will mind. She ran from 1880 right through till 49. You may travel over Germany or China or Japan, but you'll never meet the equal of the Giant's Causway Tram. She left the Giant's Causeway and went through the sandy hills, across the bush and around the bend till she came to Old Bush Mills. Then up the brae by Stranna Lane, while going at full power, she passed the Corrie Classy, doing 7 miles an hour. One Easter Monday morning, she was travelling to Portrush. So many folk were on her, the conductor had to push. But going up the Clooney there, with the hump upon the track, and instead of running forward, the funny old tram ran back. Old Lutcher Tom McConnell, he was spitting on the floor, till a certain lady passenger could stand the sight no more. She asked conductor Charlie Shaw if spitting he'd permit. Says he, aye, surely missy, just go ahead and spit. And now the tram is finished, and we'll never see her again, for the cars are used for chicken coops and nothing now remains. My father got the station house, and Eastwood bought the track, and no matter how long you wait for her, she'll never be coming back.